Thank you so much. This was the greatest introduction I ever got, so I feel very privileged. Thank you, Stefan. Could we maybe switch off the light? That would be great. I can even do that. All on. With a nice little romantic fade out. Good evening. So, I have this kind of issue that I have to talk about the nightmare of participation, which will not be that easy. Because, of course, when we think about participation, we usually think of it as a kind of all-inclusive model. And what I'm going to try tonight is I'm going to try to rethink that model of participation as we know it, and basically use the role of the architect or the spatial practitioner to develop possibly an emerging role around that. I'm just going to quickly recap what Stefano already introduced. So basically I have these two structures in which I work. One is Studio Miessen, which is essentially kind of research and consulting office, which also includes teaching, writing, and those kind of activities, curatorial practices. And another one, which is an office, which is really in the most kind of positive sense of the word, a conventional architecture office, in the sense that it only deals with things that are physically constructed. So in a way, it's a very simple divide between kind of non-physical things on the left and physical things on the right. What really struck me a couple of years ago was that there's this very kind of positive discourse that started in the early 90s around the issue of participation, which, especially in the art world, was taken kind of very seriously. But what also was interesting about it was that when you looked at it in terms of politics at the time, especially in the UK under New Labour, and for example in countries like Holland, where there's, in the Netherlands, where there's a kind of political model called the polder model, which is all about consensus. I was kind of struck that participation is actually quite often used as a tool for political legitimization. And what do I mean by that? That seemingly participatory structures are being implemented so that we, the people in inverted commas, can kind of participate in those political structures. But they're actually being implemented in order to kind of justify a certain politics that afterwards can be legitimized through those structures, i.e. real participation doesn't really take place, and it's a kind of scary procedure, I find, especially under New Labour, where there's statistics. So when I talk about New Labour, there's New Labour in the UK. Towards the tail end of the 90s and early 00s, there were statistics that showed that never in history had there been more participatory structures implemented in this country, and at the same time the country was at an all-time low of people actually wanting to participate. Now the interesting thing is that, of course, as a politician, this then creates a situation where you can always say, well, we've put out the political structures for you to participate, it's your responsibility to do so. If you haven't done so, we're going to push our agenda. So it points at a very interesting thing, which is this issue of responsibility. And and this is one thing that I'm very much interested in the context of architecture. How can we as architects assume that responsibility, and how can that responsibility really become part of our practice and part of our role as architects? And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to basically turn around this kind of model of participation as we know it, which is this all-inclusive model, where we're very much used to this idea of, for example, the round table as a means of consensus building strategy, i.e. We do a kind of charrette, let's say, where you invite certain people to a table and you discuss something, and hopefully at the end you come to some kind of consensus. I think this model is absolutely valid and it's very much needed, but I think what's even more needed right now in architecture is a model which is almost the inversion of that, which is where people as individuals assume within their role so much responsibility that they actually develop agendas that they move out there. And this might seem at first a bit weird, because what I'm saying is that it also happens without the democratic involvement, which a lot of participatory projects are trying to move towards, but I hopefully will be able to explain this through a series of projects, of which actually quite a lot of them I would consider as failed projects. But maybe this is also something that we can discuss later, this kind of question of the value of failure. I think in architecture schools we're quite used to kind of optimization and the idea that we move always towards a kind of moment of success. But the question for me is really what happens in this process. And usually the moment when something fails is also the moment that you learn. And this is also maybe coming back to this thing that we talked earlier in the panel about research and practice. How can research actually really not be something that just happens and then you practice, but research is really part of your practice. And then the other thing that interests me in this kind of context of participation is also how one can establish structures that don't only force or enforce consensus or are working towards consensus, but are actually working towards a kind of design dissensus. So how can you set up structures in which a polarity of voices, a polarity of individuals, institutions, organizations, whatever it is, can exist and can exist in a kind of agonistic space, i.e. that all these voices are still being recognized and heard, can have a conversation, but without them being kind of antagonistic in the sense that it's not productive. So one of the approaches that I'm really interested in or trying to develop at the moment is this kind of role that one assumes without mandate, which is very bluntly put a role that does not start from the point of view of, for example, a client coming to you and asking you to design a museum or whatever it is, but for you to actually be a proactive practitioner. Now, of course, I mean, if I was in the audience, I would say, well, that's of course very difficult because you're not gonna kind of just, if, for example, you were interested in doing museums, you're not just gonna do a museum by yourself without a client, but hopefully by the end of this, we'll get a little bit closer to an idea of how this role can be assumed. I think it was also particularly interesting that Teddy Cruz, for example, was part of this afternoon's panel discussion, since he's definitely one of the practitioners that I would almost describe as a role model for this kind of way of acting, which is that you really move out there with an agenda and you create projects. Now, I also, of course, understand that this is often quite difficult in a kind of time of economic despair, but there's definitely models that can be developed, and also, I think, quite interesting models that we can look at. One of the other things is what's interesting in terms of the maybe alternative approach to participation is something that was developed by a group of two guys in Berlin about 10 years ago, which was a model that they call participation plus X, which is a very kind of simple way of saying that there cannot be a kind of default mode of participation, but every single situation is absolutely different, not in terms of necessarily the local physical context, but in terms of the force field of stakeholders, people who are involved in a project. Because, of course, we all know a project is not only about, for example, in a conventional setting, client and architect, but there's hundreds of people who are involved in this whole process. So what I'm showing here is 6 different images of either projects or kind of activist work, public demonstrations, art projects that have a certain kind of territorial aspect to them. And they're all kind of pointing at the question of from which position is one talking, i.e. when we talk about participation or these kind of proactive practices, they're actually quite different if we look at the kind of territory, also the kind of social territory in which they take place. And the image I'm most interested in here is the image on the top left, which is this one, which is an image from the House of Lords in London in the UK. And for those of you, I'm sure you're all familiar, but I'm going to repeat, or I'm going to tell you anyway. This is the kind of, let's say, conservative or more conservative of the two kind of representative democratic parts of the British government. It's not the one which is elected by the people, but it's one which is essentially the people that you see there. They're either there because they have a certain kind of family tradition or lineage, or because they've been selected by the Queen for certain kind of things that they've done in the past. Now, what I'm really interested in, and I'm only showing this image not to be taken too serious in terms of my kind of political background. I'm not interested in the conservative nature of this as a space, but I am quite interested in the spatial setting of this, and I'm interested particularly in this group that you can see in the middle, the guys that are basically facing the left. And those guys are called the crossbenchers, and there's two interesting things about this. One is that they're all independent politicians, so they don't belong to either party, so they're neither Tories, Conservatives, or Labour, but they're independent. They don't belong to either of them. And this is literally reflected by the spatial setting, so they're sitting in the middle. And what interests me about them is not only how they're located, but also the fact that because they're independent, they don't have to subscribe or pre-subscribe to the consensual politics of either of the two parties. Because as we all know, if you're part of a kind of formal party, which can also be very powerful, I'm not trying to undermine any kind of politician who's part of whatever party, but there are certain kind of internal struggles with every party, and usually you very much have to subscribe to those struggles. So by the time that you can actually make a decision, quite a lot of it has been washed down. So basically what my research is looking at the moment, which the latest kind of part of this research, which was a kind of trilogy on participation, was this book called The Nightmare of Participation, and this really tried to, let's say, explore the potential of this role of the crossbencher as a mode of praxis. So how can this actually become an interesting role model, this kind of independent being in between? So you could talk about this in terms of agency, you could talk about this in terms of proactive individualism, you could talk about this in terms of participation, but maybe not such a kind of, let's say, romantic form of participation. And to give you a bit of background information of how I got there, in this kind of year that Stefano just talked about at the London Consortium, which was my MA project essentially, I started a kind of ongoing research project that's called Did Someone Say Participate? And it was really to look at this, what I found was kind of like a problematic rendering of these, a very romantic rendering of a lot of participatory practices that are at play. And what really interested me was to look at how something that we could describe as spatial practice is really operating and working today. i.e., you know, why is, for example, something that we call spatial practice, whatever that means, I mean, that is still, I pretty much think this yet needs to be properly defined, but how does that offer something else than, for example, a conventional, and I'm not saying this with disrespect, just to explain again also all these things that we were being talked about Zaha before. I'm not saying this about Zaha because I think she's a bad designer. I think she's a great designer, but she's interested in a very particular strand of design. And it seems to me that what those people that have been involved with what we could call spatial practice or critical spatial practice, what they're interested in is not more complex in qualitative terms, but more complex in terms of the things that they're looking at and the things that they understand as informing elements of the design process. So this book that you see here, which is called Did Someone Say Participate? An Atlas of Spatial Practice, was a kind of first and very naive way of trying to come to terms with this subject. And it tried to look at it almost like a children's book would do. So you basically open up a territory in which, or an atlas in which certain practices can come into play and are being presented as a kind of early overview of well, I don't want to say movement, but maybe of a certain strand of practice. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a couple of examples just so that you can locate this somewhere on the horizon. This is an image from a project called Women on Waves. It's a project by a Dutch activist called Rebecca Gompertz. And it's a very interesting project because it unites, let's say, kind of territorial approach to politics and intervention, and an art project, which is this container that you can see on this vessel in the foreground. The container is an abortion clinic, and this vessel that you can see there is being stopped by two military vessels of the Australian Navy who are trying to stop it from entering territorial waters. So this whole project is basically, I should start by saying that there was actually never an abortion carried out in the box, in this container. But what the project was about was for the ship to go to countries where abortion is illegal and to enter territorial waters, to pick up women from shore who would carry out an abortion, obviously in a country where it's illegal. So anyway, so this was never done, so i.e. there was never an abortion taking place or carried out in the container. But that was also not what the project was about. The project was about the kind of territorial implications and the question, and raising a certain awareness of this. And I think this is quite an interesting image also to show how serious this was taken as a kind of action. This is another project which is in the book, which is being elaborated in the book, which is an image from a project about demining in northern Iraq. So this guy that you can see there is one of 800 people that very slowly move their way through this field in order to rid it of mines. So now we could, of course, ask, well, what the hell does that have to do with spatial production? But maybe this is a good example for some of these things that we discussed earlier, where also the non-physical or almost aphysical can become a tool to establish a certain ground for something else to happen. So in this case, absurdly, someone is taking something away, but by taking something away rather than adding something, he or she has an immense impact on the kind of opportunity or potential that this field will have, i.e. if you would look at this place now, there would probably be a village. I'm showing also an image from a very interesting kind of longer-term research project, which has kind of very concrete impact and implications in Israel-Palestine by architect Eyal Weizmann, who runs the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths. He's been involved very much with a series of NGOs in both Palestine and Israel, and the human rights organization B'Tselem, which basically commissioned him to do a series of, seemingly drawings, which basically talk about the built-up areas and land reserves of the West Bank. And there's a whole, I would very much urge all of you to look at his books and his writing, which is very important, I think, to architecture students today. One of the kind of theories that he developed, which he called the Politics of Verticality, which look at the relationship of hilltop settlements and their way, their kind of, let's say, politics of kind of overlooking politics, let's say. So in this sense, the reason why I'm showing this is, again, this is something that is seemingly non-physical, and we would probably ask, especially in the context of architecture, well, okay, it's a drawing, and we all know that, for example, at in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there's been a lot of paper architecture around, which was usually the kind of default for those practitioners that couldn't build. They would just kind of build these kind of dream castles in books instead. So all the kind of projects that could never happen, they would end up in books. And drawing would be the tool for that. But this is a very different story here because, okay, it's just drawn, but has a huge impact because it shows something that wasn't shown before. So this is something that I think that all of you should also consider, the kind of powerful tool that you have when you use drawing. This is very important. So visual notation basically becomes a form of practice. And a form of, well, not only practice, but really a form of being able to intervene also. These two images, they're not part of the book, but I'm showing them because they're touching on quite a lot of issues that the book is touching on. And basically what they talk about is the results of architectural decision-making as we know it, and the kind of backside of some of those processes that architects or in general kind of planners are involved in. So what you see on the left, I'm sure you all know this, the Herzog and Demining and IOA project for the Beijing Olympics, which is a fantastic building. And on the right, we see an image which is actually not directly linked to this project on the left, but could easily be. It's connected to a kind of similar massive scale development project where basically a whole area of houses in an area which has historically been grown had to be destroyed in order to build those developments. And basically a single individual went through a legal process of protesting against it. And the physical kind of spatial result of that legal process was what you see on the right, i.e. they actually had to carve around it in order to prepare the site for building. These are just a couple of images from a series of projects that are also in the book. This is on the left, you see an image from a photographic series by Bas Prinsen, who's a Dutch architect and photographer, and on the right it's the start of a chapter by artist Johanna Berlin, who did a beautiful piece, actually a music piece, where she brought together 14 kids from different parts of former Yugoslavia to sing a song, which sounds kind of maybe incredibly naive or maybe not very spatial, but if you look at it closely, it's absolutely amazing in that sense. It's also a project about Mexico City's kind of contemporary gated housing situation and the very interesting kind of mimicry that's going on between the architecture of those houses and the kind of small-scale booths which house the security officers that are supposedly looking after those houses. And this is an image by Armin Linke, who looked at the Davos World Economic Forum and its kind of spatial implications during the forum that take place in the village of Davos in Switzerland. But one of the things that was really important within the production of this book and the kind of ongoing research was that it wouldn't just be a kind of book and the moment that the book is finished and designed and printed, that's it, but it's really like an ongoing process which is also a process of learning for us, and hopefully it doesn't stop. So there were a series of events that were connected to this where there was really this idea of producing a kind of ongoing discourse around it and basically to receive material to feed into this as a research project. So what you see here is an image from OMA's pavilion for the Serpentine Gallery in 2007, and it was a very interesting event, which was a 24-hour kind of interview marathon, you could say, by Rem and Hans-Ulrich Obrist. And so they basically invited, I believe, 48 practitioners, theorists, a cross-section of people all over London, who they would talk to for 24 hours. So in any case, this format was very interesting for us because we use it as a chance to kind of collect further data, and There was, until very recently, unfortunately it doesn't exist anymore, a website which was also called Did Someone Say Participate, where all this kind of ongoing material was collected. One of the projects that kind of links almost directly to one of the things that we discussed in the courtyard, which is the question of whether kind of conflict or politics can be physically designed, is a project we were working on for the Lyon Biennial in 2007. And I might actually start by saying that I think this project failed terribly. But at the same time, I think it was quite interesting as a process to learn from, because it tried to deal with this question of whether conflict can be designed on the scale of a table, basically, or the scale of a piece of furniture. And the whole notion of spatial perceptions of Europe. So when we were invited by the curators of the Biennial, the idea for the whole Biennial was to create a kind of history book for the first decade of the 21st century. And our kind of immediate response at the time was that it should have something to do not only with Europe, but the whole issue of kind of electoral processes in Europe, because it was just after 2 of the referenda for the European Constitution had failed in 2 countries. And so one of the things that really interested us as architects was how the kind of perception of Europe as a space might have a huge implication on how people think about Europe and what kind of vote they would possibly cast. So, i.e., as a hypothesis, you know, if we have to make a kind of considered choice about Europe and how it should be in the future, it's actually really important to be able to imagine it as a space, because it's quite difficult to think about something that you can't imagine as a space. So there were kind of 2 things that interested us about this. One was the kind of this kind of notion of you going in a kind of ballot booth to cast your vote, but then also, of course, this kind of larger implication of literally Europe as a geographical space. So the very kind of simple and naive thing that we did was to just use a round table, which, as we discussed before on the panel, is historically a space of consensus, i.e. it's a space where people meet, where people are invited to come together to hopefully at the end of that meeting or that series of meetings that they might have to reach a point of consensus. And so what we were interested in to almost invert this model and create a kind of ballot booth situation within the round table. So a means to actually start to engineer kind of conflict between those different interests on the table. So all these drawings that you can see on the wall in the back are basically 100 visualized spatial perceptions of Europe so basically so this is 100 drawings, so 50 of them are all the participants of the biennial, like all the artists that were invited to be part of the biennial that year. So we sent them an email each and said, okay, we need your perception, please send it. So this could be, you know, some would do a drawing, some would send a photo of something that they thought kind of characterized their spatial perception. Some would even write something. And then the other half is people that we approach globally from all sorts of different fields, all sorts of different backgrounds, milieus, to do the same. So what you see in the back is those 100 kind of pre-produced drawings to the biennial. They were already there when the biennial opened. And then what you see on the table is, well, actually at the moment you don't see it because they were gone, but there was a stack of copies of all those drawings in this only shared space of the round table, which is this middle section that you can see there. And the idea was that basically the audience of the biennial would then start to hijack those or kind of corrupt those existing perceptions, i.e. they would take a copy of those that were already on display and would superimpose their own perception onto this. So basically slowly the wall would then fill up with the superimpositions of the existing kind of spatial perceptions. So these, for example, are some of the ones that were kind of pre-produced. And these are a couple of pages from a book that was then later produced. These were the ones that were sent before, and then so in the book there's basically 100 drawings that were being produced before the biennial, and then 100 selected out of 6,000 that were produced during the biennial, which are these. But one thing that was also really important with this project was that it had a kind of another layer, let's say, of knowledge production about it, which was a book called The Violence of Participation, which looked specifically into this project, but not as a kind of self-congratulatory, let's say, publication about the actual project or the design, but to lead a series of conversations around the issue of spatial perceptions of Europe and conflictual space, and how we can somehow consider this also through the tools and means of design. So there were basically 10 conversations about this topic, and the idea was that you wouldn't just talk to artists and curators, because we all know what, no, that's a good generalization, but there's a lot of stuff that, since we're all kind of in the same milieu, we know what we're all talking about. So the idea was really to bring also very differentiated positions together. So just to give an example, here is kind of probably the two most polar opposites of the discussion. One on the right that some of you might be familiar with is Chantal Mouffe, a political theorist who has been very much on the forefront of this kind of debate about agonism and kind of non-consensual forms of debate and politics. She's based at Westminster University in London. And the guy on the left, who's Oscar Kilave, he used to be my mountain guide on Kilimanjaro. And he's never left his country and only has been in touch with Europe, or basically his whole perception of Europe is being described through the very temporary relationship that he has with people like me who are stupid enough to pay $800 to go to the top of a mountain. Okay, now what we find interesting about this is that you then actually also, through a kind of conversation format, get very different kind of territorial perceptions. Whether some of them might overlap in terms of their agenda, that I leave it to you. And I mean, whoever wants to read this, I'm happy to send a PDF if they give me their email address. And the project that was came almost immediately out of this was a project that we later called EastCoast Europe, which there was a very funny kind of coincidence that the commissioner for the cultural projects of Slovenia's presidency during the EU Council in 2008 was actually a guest at the biennial, and she saw the work and then approached basically two kind of agencies, let's say, to be the curators for the New York chapter of the presidency of the EU Council of Slovenia, which was basically a School of Missing Studies, who's an amazing group, which I would also very much urge you to look up. And in this particular project, it was Sergeant Jovanovic Weiss and Catherine Carl, who spearheaded this part of the project, and then myself. So basically the three of us were curating this 6-month cultural project for Slovenia, which mainly took place in New York, since a lot of the meetings took place at the UN. And one of the things that really interested us was that there's an interesting history to those projects, these cultural projects that happen alongside the EU presidencies of the different countries. The image you can see here, for example, is an image of a project that probably most of you are aware of. It's this kind of European identity redesign done by AMO, which is this barcode, which the most kind of visible component of this is the flag they designed, which is this barcode flag on the bottom. But the funny thing there was that they actually produced it for, well, it was commissioned by Romano Prodi for the EU, and then when it was done, they were so scared to implement it that they kind of dropped it. But then during Austria's presidency of the EU Council, they basically bought it as a project of the EU and used it as a kind of PR and identity creation mechanism for their presidency. And so during this kind of particular cultural project, which was also 6 months, what really was striking is that there's also a super interesting approach to the question of identity and European identity, but it was what we thought was lacking in this project was that it was purely produced through visual representation rather than a kind of other format of, let's say, discussion or debate. And so we were really asking ourselves, well, if we're now dealing with the situation in Slovenia, which is super interesting because it's a wonderfully small country with wonderfully young politicians, it's absolutely amazing. But how do you then possibly start to produce an identity for that particular 6 months of their presidency, which actually has to do something with content and the production of content rather than representation? And we came up with a really stupid one-liner, which was literally to say that Europe has an East Coast. Since the project was taking place in New York, which is obviously on the East Coast of the States or the continent, we just imagined for a moment what would happen if Europe was an island and actually had an East Coast. So the right red line that you can see there is that imagined line. And what we were particularly interested in with a kind of fictional shift like this, what then starts to happen when this new border, which is of course, you could say, well, it is already a border, but if you really start to think of it as a kind of physical divide, how do you actually then start to perceive this kind of other shore in inverted commas? So everything that's now east of that border. So just to give an example, if one would imagine, which was a huge discussion at the time, whether Turkey would become part of the Union. If it would, then, for example, Turkey, or in other words, the European Union, would have a direct border with Iran. And what would that mean in terms of politics, economic exchange, blah, blah, blah. So this was kind of what we were trying to get at. And one of the things that we then did was to go back to this map, basically people, practitioners, theorists, different backgrounds from that East Coast of Europe to the East Coast of the US, namely New York, to through different events at, for example, the New School and the New York Public Library, to have debates around this kind of question of both spatial perception and territorial shifts and the notion of physical borders today. Which also kind of absurdly ended up in a visual representation. So I'm taking back everything I said before about not trying to visually represent something, which is these kind of bumper stickers. I'm sure you're familiar with those if you've ever been on a trip to Europe. Now this has slightly changed, but back in the days this was absolutely necessary if you wanted to cross a physical border within Europe by car. You had to buy one of those stickers from your own country and slap them on the back of your car so that they would know where you're coming from, basically. So this is a selection of those from that line, and there was then another series of projects that had to do with the placing of those in a series of cities along this kind of imagined line. This is one which is actually not on that line, but in Berlin on Karl Marx Allee, which is the kind of central corridor in the city that takes us straight east. And one of the outcomes of this project was a publication called EastCoast Europe, which really tries to bring together all these kind of conversations and debates that took place during these 6 months. And one thing that's really important to understand is also in terms of publishing, there was a very particular approach to this book, because we didn't look at this as a kind of as very kind of serious research, but rather as something that happened almost in an ad hoc manner, and something that doesn't have a kind of let's say academic well, not only not an academic feel to it, but also doesn't even claim to be that kind of reflected, but something that happens immediately and with a kind of intuition. So this was also why we then decided that if you produce content like this, i.e. if you only have like 3 months time to produce a book, It should also not be something precious, but something that's almost kind of magazine-like, or something that, you could also imagine, just reading it once, or just reading one chapter and then throwing it away. Or, in fact, using a similar kind of politics to how a lot of people use magazines, which is that, friends over at your house and they see something and you said, well, I've read it already anyway, why don't you take it? So really this question of distribution. So, of course, what we're most used to is a kind of let's say mode of distribution, which is based on official channels of distribution. So, for example, to have a publisher, which would then produce, especially in the kind of context that we're talking about, like the art world or architecture world, which is a very niche market, you would usually produce between 1,000 and 2,000 copies, and then those, would hopefully sell over 5 years or not. But they're quite expensive to produce, especially if we're talking about books in the art world, which tend to be very nicely produced physically. So what we started with was a kind of research into what could possibly be the cheapest printer globally. And we were really surprised because we thought this would either be somewhere in Eastern Europe or China. But we actually found out that the cheapest printer would be in Denmark, which is one of the most expensive countries in Europe. And this printer was a printer that usually produced these kind of pulp fiction novels. So the kind of shit that you buy at Borders on the airport and you pay $5 and you read it or not on the plane, and by the time you get to the next airport you throw it away. So this was interesting because they really deal with standardized production, and we found out that you could do a 333-page book for 40 cents per copy. And so instead of producing like 2,000 very nice books that you could put on your coffee table, we decided that we're just going to use that budget to produce 10,000, and that those 10,000 would then be split in terms of conventional distribution and kind of trashy distribution. So 2,000 were distributed through Sternberg Press, which is a kind of art publishing house in Berlin and New York, and the rest of the 8,000 we either distributed ourselves, or we set up a series of events. This is an image from the first launch that we did at the Swiss Institute in New York, where basically we put 1,000 copies in the room on Euro pallets like this, and people could just take them for free. So basically this is what you ended up with, that people would walk away with taking 5 copies, which was actually something that we were really interested in terms of how that could then start to inform almost a kind of like viral distribution network. Okay, now we have a bit of a kind of break in terms of content. Because one other thing that I'm really interested in talking about tonight is the kind of educational project that I'm involved in and very interested in terms of also maybe a shift in perception in terms of a cultural context, both in which one talks, but also from which one talks, i.e. I'm from Germany, which means I'm in Europe, which means I'm part of the West, and how does that affect the way that I look at things. And so I've been involved in a project that I started a couple of years ago called the Winter School Middle East, which started in a super weird way, because I was never thinking that I would ever kind of go to Dubai kind of because I wanted to. But we were committed, so when I say we, this is Shumon Bazar, who was also the co-editor of Did Someone Say Participate, and myself were commissioned by a think tank, like a government think tank in Dubai, who set up a conference called the International Design Forum to produce a book, basically. And it was kind of funny because so these 2 books were basically commissioned by this think tank. So what you see on the left is this publication called Almanac by OMA AMO, which is kind of in typical AMO fashion, kind of satellite view research project of the Gulf region, which is an absolutely fascinating study. But it looks at the region, as I said, from a kind of bird's eye view. So it looks at the territory in very kind of conventional, I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but in kind of conventional like a conventional geographer would do. So basically a series of maps and trying to understand those maps and kind of implications of those maps. And at some point the organizers of this conference got a bit cold feet that this would be a bit one-sided. So they basically commissioned us to do kind of on the ground part, if you want, so almost like a kind of second publication that would cover the other side of things. So if you look at the urban condition in the Gulf region today, what would this look like if you look at it from the point of view of the street and kind of production on the ground. So we did this in a kind of, again, very naive way, like we basically asked ourselves, okay, so what are the typologies that a child would use to describe a city? Like house, wall, courtyard, whatever they are. And we basically then had two contributions per kind of typology. One was always textual and one was always visual, to try to come to terms with these kind of conditions there at the time. But this is not what I want to talk about, because I want to talk about the Winter School. And actually the funny thing was that the setting in which this took place, as I said, was this International Design Forum. This is an image from the first night. This was a 3-day conference. And so what you see here is one of the panels. And if you would turn the camera around now to the audience, there would be 800 people in the audience, and each of them paid $800 to be there, which to us was quite something, because, okay, I'm aware that for some academic conferences you have to pay, but maybe I was just naive, but I never thought that, for these kind of events you have to pay so much money. But I'm not trying here to be some kind of anti-capitalist kind of negativity man. But what I want to say is that it was quite surprising that, of course, when you realize that this is the framework in which it happens, you also very quickly realize that it's only a certain group of people that can attend this. And it's certainly not students. And you can imagine it was mainly representatives of globally operating architecture companies and kind of local policymakers, urban planners, and so on. And what was really intriguing to see was that also in terms of the criticality of the event, so this one was, for example, a panel about the infrastructural changes of the Gulf region, mainly on the example of Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And so the audience was absolutely packed, so 800 people, full house. And so this next morning was a discussion about these two research projects, one by OMA and the other one by us. So you can see here on the panel, for example, Rem on the left and Stefano Bueri on the right end. And there were 8 people in the audience. And this to us was, I mean, on the one hand quite telling, but also what was even more interesting was that not only were kind of the kind of larger, very generally speaking, kind of student body not at this conference and didn't really have the chance to engage, but every time we went for a cigarette break outside, because you had to leave into the courtyard to smoke, there would be these groups of students, mainly girls actually, who just came rushing at everyone who would leave this place, which was this kind of business-style hotel, and just bombard us with questions. And one of the interesting things was then, okay, immediately, I guess this would be the same with all of us. You start thinking about the kind of educational frameworks that are in place and, how one could possibly kind of do something with that or kind of become engaged in this. But on the other hand, what was very interesting was that at this very same time, which was in 2007, there had just been a lot of the American universities that went out, especially the Ivy League universities, that had just started moving out into the region. So just to give you a bit of background on that, so basically after 9/11, a lot of Middle Eastern families decided they're no longer going to send their kids to the States to study. And this also created a bit of an awkward situation in many universities because there was simply a lot of cash missing. And so many of the universities decided that to start kind of satellite campuses. But this is not only a US phenomenon, I mean, it also happened with European campuses and universities. But what was really interesting was that since a lot of the American universities that were very involved there have such kind of huge names that everyone is aware of and everyone thinks very highly of, it produced a very interesting situation in the region, which was that all of a sudden there was a kind of almost competition about education, but in a very kind of almost aggressive way, so that, you know, every city-state wanted to have like the greater university, like, I don't know, Harvard Medical School really needs to come to Dubai and not to Abu Dhabi. But then what it created was a situation in which all of a sudden Saudi, which is obviously very kind of conservative in terms of its educational settings, where, for example, it wasn't really kind of standard that girls could go to study, and if so, they would definitely not be in the same space with men. All of a sudden, there was a decision in Saudi that King Abdullah University would be entirely redesigned, but not only redesigned physically, but also in terms of its kind of social protocols. So all of a sudden, because of a very simple move of a series of educational facilities to the larger region, one very conservative country decides that, okay, in order to be part of this game, we're going to have to change our political protocols. And now there's this university where all of a sudden it's like completely open, and we're looking at a situation in which, you know, guys and girls are studying together in the same room, etc. So out of this kind of, let's say, turf at that time, I then went back to London, where I was living at the time, and tried to convince the director of the institution where I was teaching at the time, the AA, to start a small program there called the Winter School, which worked very well, I thought, in the beginning, but was kind of slightly problematic because also the AA decided that they were going to have kind of fees for this, and the fees were actually quite high given the short amount of time that these workshops would take place in January, so it would be between 10 to 14 days workshops. And so then at some point I decided that it would make more sense to start this as a kind of independent organization, which is now registered basically as a non-profit in Kuwait and Germany. But in the first two editions of the school, which took place in Dubai in 2008 and 2009, I'm going to give you a bit of background information here, what we did. So basically how it works is that it's an annual series of events, which always take place in January. And in the beginning, they were taking place in Dubai. Now they're in Kuwait for a longer period. And then there's kind of smaller satellites of this engagement, which the next one will be in Beirut in January next year. This is an image from the first year, which the Winter School is always interested in a kind of annual theme that will then be explored through a series of events and research projects. This was in the first year, and which was looking precisely at the labor camp situation in Dubai. So this is an image that you can see of an area called Sunapur, which is one of the bigger labor camps in the city. It houses 60,000 people, and it's located basically, I mean, very bluntly put, on the way from the, well, you can't really say city center because it doesn't exist, but the kind of inner area of the city on your way to the airport, and it's completely boarded off to the outside. But then if you get in, this is basically what you find. So it's very generic housing, and you can imagine the rooms are pretty small for many people. But one of the things that we really wanted to avoid was that you go there as a Westerner with this kind of attitude that we all know that they're all doing bad things, and you know, this kind of labor policies that they're employing are absolutely outrageous. But actually with a bit more reflection that also incorporates our own kind of you know, home situations at times. So here you see two images, one on the left, which is an image taken in this place, in Sunapur, one of these kind of courtyards with the rooms. And then the one on the right is an image taken in Düsseldorf, which is one of the richest cities in Germany, actually on the main shopping street, which is called the Königsallee. And it's a container, one of the many containers outside a new development for an expensive department store. And this is where the laborers live that work on this project. Now, I'm not showing this to say, you know, one is better or the other. I'm just showing this to say that there's a huge problem when we as Westerners, especially as, often with journalists, it's actually the same, go to other parts of the world and have very preconceived image of what we're kind of critiquing, but also to do with the way that that a certain discourse, a certain critical discourse in journalism has been taking place over the last 10 years, which is looking at the Middle East, precisely the Gulf region, with a lot of pessimism and a lot of critique, which is quite often very unreflected and particularly problematic when a certain argument is just being regurgitated over and over again without actually rethinking it. So this was really one of the starting points, like how could you then try to deal with this situation, but not from a point of view of just kind of critique and pessimism, which we thought would be kind of unproductive, but really as a means of direct engagement with these areas, you know, spending time there, talking to people, talking also to the decision makers in place, which would obviously not be in the camps but elsewhere, and trying to get a kind of closer understanding of how these processes and dynamics work. So there's a group of 12 students, one of the studios, which was led by a Turkish artist called Can Altay. The way it works usually with the winter school is that we always bring in a practitioner from outside the region, which will then be coupled up with a practitioner from the region. And they teach together, a group of students. They tend to be sometimes international, more international, sometimes less international. In Dubai they were quite international. In Kuwait it's mainly regional students. But the important thing there is that actually you don't follow a model which, for example, is being used a lot by the US universities, which is these kind of revolving contracts, where people from the home campuses, let's say in the States, are being sent over for 3 years. They don't have really any knowledge about the region. They teach the same curriculum, and then after 3 years, they go back to the States, and the next person comes. So here it's really this idea that people get teamed up, and then one always kind of stays behind in inverted commas, so that the kind of knowledge that's being produced is being kind of continued through other research projects. This is an image from one of the presentations by one of the studios, which looked at the production of these kind of spaces in the city and the question of labor, not through through means of physical design, but through means of oral history. So what they did was to kind of follow on my argument about not just following, stepping in this trap of kind of regurgitating arguments about the labor problem in Dubai as we know it, i.e. construction labor, to really look closely at the labor situation in general. And basically they conducted a series of 42 interviews with people throughout the whole social spectrum of Dubai. So starting with the Bangladeshi construction laborer, the Russian prostitute, South Korean mobile phone dealer, all the way up to the cultural attaché, who's this guy called she's no longer there, but was this guy called Michael Schindhern, who used to run the German opera and then had been bought by the Dubai government to become their kind of cultural minister / attaché. And what's interesting is kind of like these two oppositions, or not oppositions, but these kind of two very different milieus, which have all these gradients in between, which is what these guys were talking about. But to also realize that at the end of the day, they're all more or less in the same situation, which legally in the same situation, not kind of economically, but that they're all on contracts that can be terminated immediately and that they can no longer that they can work a maximum of 3 years in the country. So this, just as an example of how sometimes these studios would work. And in, well, actually last year, one of the former students in Dubai, Zara Alibaba, gave or allowed for this kind of opportunity to occur to move the winter school to Kuwait and to start working there with a kind of longer engagement. So not to just have these kind of annual workshops in the winter, but hopefully for this to really be built up into something that has a longer term, not only agenda, but also presence in the city. Because what's really important to understand is that in both those cities, the idea of a civil institution or these kind of platforms that follow a certain tradition of civil institutions is basically non-existent. So that could have many different phases, let's say, like, I don't know, a project space or a gallery or a kind of museum with a lecture program, like all these things essentially don't exist. So that's why this idea of a kind of ongoing platform is even more important, i.e. that, you know, it's not only temporary, but it actually would have a space and it has an ongoing programming. So this is, for those of you who are interested in this, I mean, also everyone obviously is most welcome to take part in this in the future. There's a website called winterschoolmiddleeast.org where you can find more information about this. But one of the things that we're really now exploring is this kind of partnering up with different institutions and organizations, most of them NGOs, to set up a structure so that this can be run also more professionally in the future, so that we can actually have a kind of slightly larger budget to bring people and all these kind of things that come with this. One of the projects that was connected to it last year was this part of this GSD fellowship at Harvard that I did together with Joseph Grima, who's the editor of Domus, which I'm sure most of you know, and great, very interesting Italian architecture and design magazine. And it was a project called Diwania, which was really the starting point for the ongoing research project and the annual theme for the first winter school in Kuwait, which took place in January this year. And Kenny actually was also one of the people that taught that. So basically, we started looking at what we thought was an incredibly interesting theme and urban typology in Kuwait, which is a historic typology called Diwania, which is these spaces which, you know, to most of us look like, you know, maybe formal or not so formal, or maybe even very informal hangout spaces, male-dominated. To most of us, this probably looks like a mixture of a coffee shop and a tea house. But they have a very important and intrinsically political function in Kuwaiti social life, which is that they are part of a kind of informal political decision-making process that works throughout the whole spectrum of Kuwaiti society. So this is not a space for like particularly privileged people or working class people, but it's a space where everyone comes together regardless of the background. And it's a typology that originates from nomadic culture and the fact that if you're traveling, you very often don't meet people, obviously, because you're traveling somewhere in the desert. So whenever your paths cross, in inverted commas, you set up your tents and you talk. So this is really like talking practice, but talking practice as a way of, on the one hand, exchanging information, but also trying to come to some kind of political consensus. This is the kind of history of this. But what has happened, interestingly, since it's a completely urbanized area, is that over the last 100 years, this typology of the Diwania was really developed as a kind of appendix to private houses. So if you would go anywhere in Kuwait City, you could go in any street, you would always find these very weirdly looking boxes that are just literally attached to the outside of the house. And the reason why this is done is that the courtyard as an architectural typology is historically dominated, or it's a space of the female. And the Diwania, which is this kind of space that we're looking at here, is a space that's historically dominated by men. And the idea is that that any guests that come to this place basically don't come into the house. So it's a kind of weird in-between kind of post-public space that sits between the most public, which is the street, and the most private, which is the house. And you get all facets of this. So you get, again, it's not only so that they represent a cross-section in terms of the user, but they also represent a spatial cross-section of kind of wealth and economy. So this is also a family, Diwania, but by one of the more affluent families in Kuwait. This is the interior, this is the exterior. So the interior changes to the exterior basically according to climate. So if you would have a Diwania, like these meetings during the day, would take place inside. If it would be at night, it would be outside. But another thing that really interested us in this particular typology is that it ranges dramatically from formal to informal, and it really ranges from the kind of background of the user and the places in which they're physically located in the city. So this one, as you can imagine, is in a very affluent neighborhood near one of the kind of main highways of Kuwait City. And this is in one of the refugee camps in the periphery of the city. But it's not only the same kind of spatial construct in terms of how it's organized and the kind of protocols of it, but it also has the same function, and it's actually being taken serious as that. So basically the people that meet here also make certain decisions that are then in a kind of scaled-up process are communicated by so these Diwanias, they have kind of spokespersons, and they will then kind of articulate and communicate the outcomings of some of those. When there's like more formal settings, sometimes it's also very informal, but when there's more formal events, they will communicate the outcomes to the kind of next stage, if you want. And this is also very interesting just as a setting, because these people that live there, they're called Bidun, which is not to be mistaken with Bedouin culture, i.e. nomadic culture, but Bidun means without, and it's basically people that don't have a passport, so they can't leave the country. So it's a kind of like, well, it's kind of a weird way of being stuck because you don't have an official identity. But you're still part, interestingly, of this kind of process of Diwania and those kind of formal, informal spaces of decision-making. This is, again, a very affluent one, a historic one, very informal one at a street corner. And this is an image from kind of a very formal political event in one of the Diwanias, where you regularly get kind of politicians kind of sneaking into Diwania to see what's going on. And interestingly, what's then being reflected in Parliament, which is this building, is that there's actual spaces inside the Parliament, not in the General Assembly, but as kind of side pockets, if you want, where you have again the same spatial layout and these kind of conversation spaces where things are being discussed. So I'm going to flick through this very quickly because otherwise you're going to get too tired. It was the production process of this, and it was also very interesting that Zara, who's this girl there and the co-director of the winter school, was really in many of those places one of the first women that ever gained access to those spaces. And also what I should add is politically, the Diwania had an amazing function, especially over the last 5 years, because a couple of years ago, 3 female candidates for the government election were the first ones that kind of forced their way into Diwania, and they managed to basically be elected on the basis that they were really the ones that intruded those spaces. So now there's actual female representatives in Kuwaiti parliament. This is just a couple of images from this show that we set up at the GSD, an image from kind of installation at Storefront Gallery in New York. And these are just a couple of images from the last winter school in which Kenny also took place, which then really tried to look at the sort of new setting which was within the Cultural Council, took place in the Cultural Council of Kuwait. This is one of the kind of explorations in the city. We always have these reading rooms. I'm going to flick through this quickly. This was one of the presentations. And one of the things that's also very important for us is that it's always works as a very social setting. So this, for example, was one of the events that we just located or outsourced somewhere in the city where we then had barbecue. Okay, I'm going to promise, I know that some of you are already tired, so I'm going to promise I keep this short. This is a project which I think is probably quite interesting in this setting of or some of the questions that we discussed before, because it's to do with, well, design for sure and the city, and how to think something that usually is considered as physical as something that could potentially be non-physical. It's a project called the European Kunsthalle, which took place in Cologne between 2004 and 2007. This is an image from the original beautiful Kunsthalle building in Cologne. For those of you who are not familiar with this typology of the Kunsthalle, it's essentially an artistic, a representative space for artistic production, but not to be mistaken with a museum or an institution that has its own collection, but one which works in a very kind of romantic way, let's say, as a kind of almost like a shop front for that kind of production that's taking place in the city that it's located. So, and this is only historically, I mean, this has changed quite a lot, but so historically they're supposed to represent the art that's being produced in that city. And the Cologne one had also a very rich and amazing history in terms of the larger kind of geographical area in which it's located, which is the kind of Rhine Valley of Germany, with also a kind of very rich history of kind of activist, kind of artistic production. There's an image of Joseph Beuys knocking on the door from the outside, trying to force his way in. But at some point, the city government of Cologne decided that they were going to knock it down and replace it with a new kind of multifunctional, multi-use complex, which they then offered to the Kunsthalle that they could have a section of this building. And there was a huge outrage, as you can imagine, not only in Germany, but throughout the kind of artist community all over Europe, which led to a series of protests, both physically but also through media and other kind of devices. But it didn't really help, and kind of soon after the city government started acting and knocked the building down, which resulted in this situation of this kind of physical hole in the city. And of course what happened, once the city was facing the situation, the city government declared that they had no money to actually build the building that they proposed to replace it with. So the city was left with this kind of scar in the urban tissue, which then led to the founding of an organization called Das Loch, which literally means the hole, which is or was a non-profit, which then started with an auction, which basically asked artists from all over Europe to donate work, which they then auctioned off in the space, which resulted in 800,000 euro, which was then used for the duration of a 3-year kind of institutional research project on questions of how an institution today in the 21st century kind of both spatializes, but also what's its function in the context of a Kunsthalle. Is this even a contemporary typology, i.e. in a time when everyone has kind of global, well, not everyone, but most people, let's say in Europe at least, have a very kind of global access to information, also with the arrival of companies like the equivalent of JetBlue in the US, which would be like EasyJet, Ryanair, or whatever they're all called. You have very easy, very cheap access to a lot of places. And so what does this then mean in terms of a quote-unquote kind of European institution? So with this money, they started basically by inviting the curator Nikolaus Schafhausen to become the founding director of this kind of institution and process, which they gave the working title European Kunsthalle. And he then basically started by inviting the four of us, which is Matthias Görlich on the left, Nikolaus Hirsch and Philipp Misselwitz and myself, to become a kind of team within the institution, which didn't really exist because it was just him, which was called Spaces of Production, and which was to research for 2 years the question of kind of spatialization of institutions and its kind of a necessity or non-necessity within Europe, and the question of the physical and the non-physical. So this is just an overview of the kind of institutions that, or the kind of newly built lighthouse projects that we're all familiar with, that happened, very roughly speaking, or were finished in the last 10 years. This could also be replaced by others, of course, but I'm only showing this overview to say that they're all fantastically specific, but at the same time they're fantastically generic. So they're reacting to a very specific brief, but the underlying politics of those buildings is nothing to do with architecture as a kind of performative space, but it's got to do with city politics. So the money that drives the construction of those buildings is one which is interested in, and I'm not saying this out of kind of as a negative comment, but just as a kind of observation. It's tourism and kind of the attraction towards new audiences that drives those projects. And so one of the questions to start off with was, well, if we look at the production of those buildings and at least to a certain extent the way that they are generic and can be interchanged, you know, what really happens in the design process that produces these kind of conditions, and do they really need to be physical, or can those kind of processes or this kind of spatial performativity also be reached through other devices or kind of settings? So this is just again to show some information which was actually researched by the Art newspaper on the way that, for example, Bilbao had an effect on the number of visitors to Bilbao, and you can see it's quite an amazing one. But one of the other things that interested us in our research was how much money within these kind of projects is spent on architecture, and what that means in terms of the performative reality of the institution, i.e. if huge amounts of money are being spent on architecture, usually that means that quite little money is left for the programming. So this is an example from Sheffield in the UK. It's a project by Branson Coates, which was finished in 2006 and which cost 52 million pounds. It's called the Centre for Popular Culture and Music. And basically the day it opened, it had to close because there was zero money for programming, and it never opened again as a cultural institution. So it was planned, designed, finished, opened, closed, and now it's a series of kind of offices. I think that's in one there's a big law firm, and in the other one there's some kind of agency, I don't know. But so anyway, it doesn't function anymore as a cultural institution, a public institution, some form of extension of public space, but it has become something else. And this was one thing that we were quite worried about in general, because also we heard, for example, these stories from like curator friends of ours who worked at MoMA in New York at the time, and told us that after this kind of crazy renovation project, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars, you know, in the winter they had to, in the curatorial offices, they put down the heating to save money. So there's a very kind of interesting paradox within architecture, which always looks at the kind of finished product as the thing that should be achieved, but quite often the kind of question of performativity is not really part of the equation. So this was then really what we tried to look at with, together with a group of 30 students at the University of Aachen in Germany at the border to Holland. And they basically produced two sets of very interesting data. So one has to do with the cultural reality of, the reality of cultural institutions in Europe. But basically looking at the question of economy. So how do these institutions really work? Because every institution is super different. So some have like a lot of public funding and little other donors. Some work a lot with, I don't know, private companies or advertisement strategies, and to just get an overview and understanding of how those processes work. And the other one had to do with the question of Europe and how institutions spatialize in Europe. And this research then led to a series of interventions which were part of this 2-year project at the European Kunsthalle. The first one was a kind of, well, let's call it a kind of symposium project, which started with the implementation of what we call the Trojan horse, which was to say that in order to keep an institution, not only to keep it running, but even to establish it, you need a minimal infrastructure in terms of its setting. And this infrastructure can be as little as a room with a computer and internet, a fax machine, and a coffee machine, which is basically the stuff that you need in order to run an office. And this was then, after a long negotiation process with the city government of Cologne, was then placed in their cultural kind of ministry, which is this building. And this kind of dotted line that you can see is the section of the building that we were allowed to inhabit, which is this room. And the first kind of move that we made, or the first move that we spent money on, was to, because we negotiated that we would get this room for free, this infrastructure for free. So the first move that we spent money on was this 30-day symposium spread over the whole city center of Cologne with 2 events every day, which really try to look at this kind of typology that we coined post-public space, which is this kind of this relocation of public space in buildings that were formerly non-public or still not public, but it's a kind of typology which is now being used for, or has a certain kind of public feel to it, whether it's, you know, sometimes can even be institutions, but also public car parks, churches, like we had a synagogue, a mosque, also a brothel. So very different kind of urban typologies, but all to become the kind of sites of this ongoing 30-day symposium. And they would also range in terms of formal and informal. So what you can see, for example, on the top left is a lecture hall in one of the art museums in Cologne. And then on the bottom right, it's a very kind of informal, well, previous butcher, but then turned kind of project space. And the second project, which was developed during this time, was an exhibition project called Models for Tomorrow, which was the first exhibition of the European Kunsthalle. And it basically took place in a 1-mile radius around this Trojan horse, which is this little office space that we managed to get. And it basically moves the visitor of the exhibition through a kind of concentric ring around that space and really forces the visitor to engage with the different spatial realities and also social realities within the city center, which might at first sound like, well, the social realities are probably quite homogeneous in this city, especially in the center, but absolutely not. So you're really moving through, you know, very corporate area to a kind of rich inner city neighborhood to a very poor inner city neighborhood through a kind of series of those very different urban sections. And this walk that you can see here, you would walk in roughly an hour and a quarter if you would not move in any of the spaces. And it's basically 22 spaces, which each space was kind of carefully chosen and was then given to an artist to do a site-specific piece. This is these kind of overviews that the public would then get. Also, there again, the idea of distribution was central, so that you would try to kind of engineer alliances with local newspapers and magazines. Like, for example, we talked to these guys who produced a kind of equivalent of Time Out magazine, and so they basically then distributed 600,000 copies, which is it's not only for Cologne, but for the larger, this Rhineland area, of these kind of leaflets that you can see here, this blue thing that this lady is carrying. which was this this overview for the ring and this parkour, if you want. So the public would then basically move through the city from step to step through this kind of ring. This is an installation outside, actually, by Big Thunderpole, a Dutch art collective, Lawrence Wiener at the central train station. And these are the more kind of, let's say, although they're probably not conventional as kind of institutional representations and artwork in the city, but they're fairly conventional in the way that you perceive them when you move through urban space. But then there was also another kind of strategy which had to do with the kind of, let's say, forceful directing the audience in a kind of forceful way through a series of spaces which they probably previously wouldn't have encountered. So this is an image from a church, and you would basically have to enter the church through the back room, and there was you could even move through there when a service was going on, and you would have to move through a back staircase on the 3rd floor to the space which was previously the vicar's office, which was completely left as it was in terms of the material that was in there, but was also kind of superimposed with the artist's work. So you had a kind of constant flow of people through this church. And in other spaces like this, for example, the Chamber of Commerce, it was the same. And what was very important there was to come back to this issue of designing also non-physical kind of components. What was most important there was the design of the timetable of use, because we were very interested in this conflict of the people that usually use the Chamber of Commerce and the employees there, and to create some kind of conflictual relationship between them and the audience of the show. So there it was super important that it would be open to the audience while this kind of almost kind of ministry type administrative building was open to the public during those hours that people would work there. But then there would also be very informal sites like this call center, which is a call center which is mainly used by Turkish people that live in Cologne because they get particularly low rates on phone calls to Turkey. This is in the job center, which this Liam Gillick piece on top of the chairs where the people are waiting to be called to have a conversation about potentially getting a job. And so the question was really, okay, if you're talking about an institution that's in the making and an institution that has to address kind of contemporary questions of institutional life and reality today, not only in Europe but generally, but this was a project in Europe which addressed Europe, what are the issues that are at stake? So one of the issues that we were really interested in was to, rather than using the money to create a kind of representative architecture, to create a kind of framework for any kind of performativity that, or institutional performativity to take place, and to set up a network of people that would then be able to start to shape that institution in the making. So just to come back to this very simple Trojan horse, how it started. The idea was then also, I'm just showing a couple of the scenarios that were developed, there were several more, but there was really this idea that as an institution it could start to move, so it would actually take this idea of a European institution quite literally, so they would start to migrate through different cities and countries within Europe. But then the question was, of course, well, that's a very kind of, almost brutally naive move, that, okay, it's European, so it should go to different countries. But what could be the implications of this? And then the question, of course, was also, well, if it would move to those different places, how would this work spatially, and what kind of effect would this then have on the programming of those institutions? But also, how would this work in terms of its kind of main and simple infrastructure, so that it could use in a kind of parasitic way, i.e. that you would have the very basic setting that we use in Cologne, which could just replicate in pretty much any other kind of structure in some of those spaces where it would move. There were also some other models that were developed, which were developed purely on the basis of an economy. So at some point we even considered whether the European Kunsthalle should only ever pop up in cities which are connected to this low-cost airline Ryanair, so that basically you would use this kind of existing travel network in order to make a choice for sites. Another one was to in a very opportunistic manner, connect it directly to this program which exists in Europe called the City of Culture, where basically every 2 years a European city is funded by the EU to have this kind of huge cultural program, which uses enormous amounts of money, and to, in a very opportunistic way, claim that in order to move there during that time, i.e. move where the money is. There's also a publication about this for those of you who might be interested in this, which actually is not called Authorship and Institution. This is an old kind of cover. It's called Institution Building, and it looks at this whole process. And I'm almost finished, so just if you bear with me for 5 minutes, we can all have a drink. Just 2 more kind of design-y projects in inverted commas, which have a kind of physical component to them. One's called the Performer Hub, and another one was a project for Manifesta Biennial. In 2008, we were approached by a performer, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. It's a performance biennial in New York, which basically covers a huge territorial area in terms of the spaces where it exists, all over Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens. And they never really had a place, like a central place. It was always decentral. So it's kind of like the European Kunsthalle, but by default. So they never actually had this kind of Trojan horse. They had an office where they would organize everything during the 2 years before the biennial would take place again, but this was a totally private setting, like an office space. So one thing that Rosalie Goldberg, the director, asked us to do was basically to rethink this, or not to rethink, but to maybe come up with an idea for this kind of central space that they wanted to have, which would bring together a series of functions that would allow them to have more kind of general events that would bring together some of the issues and agendas that some of those performances that were spread out over those parts of the city would come up with. And the kind of crazy thing was that they asked us a year before the opening to do this, and then we got really excited, and we played around with lots of kind of ideas which had to do more generally with kind of infrastructural questions, but they actually never gave us a site, which of course is like an absolute killer if you want to do something, because you don't know what you're doing, where you're doing it, and what kind of implications that would have. And so they only came up with a site 4 weeks before the opening of the biennial, and they also then told us what the budget was, which was $12,000. So you can imagine, for an architect, that's kind of like hardcore realization bordering on depression. So we then thought, okay, we really have to do this quick, and we have to do it in a very brutal way. But what we're really still interested in including was this concept of basically flattening all program into one space, so it would create this kind of thing that we called a bastard, which would be not to have any more this kind of idea of pedigreed program, which would be, okay, so this space is for this space is for this, but to really bring everything together in kind of one communal space where this would hopefully create some kind of friction between the different users. And so this is this new Cooper Union building in Soho, which they finally managed to get the ground floor for this this project. And so we then were facing this kind of question, okay, so what the hell do you do with $12,000 if you only have 3 weeks to build it? And so we decided to use to put it very bluntly, this wall that you see there, the shape of that wall is basically just the continuation of a drop in the ceiling that existed in this space. So we just decided to make it more simple. We're just going to take this drop, and the higher part, which is the one in the front, will be the high part, and everything else that will be low will just be kind of backup spaces. But everything will have to happen in this front area and will be totally flattened in terms of program. So we then decided to basically just use one material, which is these OSB boards, and the only other thing that we would be allowed to buy would be strip lights, which is these things that you can see there. And so basically what this produced was a very kind of simple and homogeneous space, 250 square meter, which tried to bring together all these different kind of programs in one space. So this is when it was not very crowded, but basically in one space you would have a kind of information booth for a performer, a lecture hall, a discussion space, screening spaces, bookshop, library, interview booth, where they had this kind of radio show. And the idea was that this really all would come together in one space and hopefully create some kind of conflict between the different users. The last project I'm going to talk about is a project we did for Manifesta 8, which took place last year in Murcia in Spain. And Manifesta is basically a European biennial, which in contrast to most biennials, which usually are linked to a specific city, this one is basically a decentral one and moves throughout Europe. And so we were very interested in this particular project to explore the potential of staging conflict. And so what we did, together with a Turkish filmmaker and a huge group, well, huge, but kind of 20 different practitioners from different fields, including artistic practice, architecture, graphic design, and theory, to basically set up or stage a debate around the central questions or necessities or problematics of biennials in general, and the specific problematics of this this particular edition of Manifesta, which looked basically at the border conflicts between North Africa and the Mediterranean. And to basically stage this debate prior to the biennial, and for this same setting then to become a kind of prop at the biennial. So this, what you see here, is a kind of mimicry almost of the House of Commons in London, which was the stage set that we designed for this this setting. And then this was filmed, and the kind of edited version or snippets of that discussion were then being presented during the actual biennial in Murcia. But what was very important was that it wouldn't only be a kind of representation of the discussions that took place, but that the setting itself again became a kind of almost like replica of that process and became a kind of discussion space also during the biennial. And it's good that we're stopping now because my voice is almost gone. If you're interested in any of those projects or other things, would be most happy to receive your emails and continue the conversation. Maybe one thing that is interesting to follow is this criticalspatialpractice.org link, which has just been set up. At the moment is a kind of placeholder for something that will happen at the Städelschule in Frankfurt from October onwards. And yeah, this will kind of grow into some kind of platform and we'll hopefully be able to continue the debate. Thank you very much.